What if the Bible wasn't holy, but encrypted? Not a book of faith, but a book of force, built not to preach, but to veil. For centuries you've been told it was about rules, morality, sin, and salvation, stories of prophets and saviors meant to guide your soul. But what if that was just the surface layer? What if the Bible wasn't meant to be understood by everyone? What if its true function was never moral, but mystical? A spiritual technology encoded in symbols, numbers, and divine names so potent they were whispered only in secret, passed from mystic to mystic in the dark corners of forgotten temples. From childhood, you were told to bow before the Bible. You were taught that to question it was sin, that to interpret it outside the approved lens was blasphemy. But what if that was part of the design? What if the real spell wasn't inside the book, but around it? Because the greatest enchantment ever cast may not have been a curse, but a cover-up, convincing the masses that the Bible is merely a rule book when it was always a ritual manual. The words aren't just poetic, they're vibrational. The parables aren't just lessons, they're locks. And the names of God? Not names at all. They're formulas, circuits, codes, tools. This book doesn't just tell stories, it conceals systems. Hidden behind the stories of Moses, Jesus, Solomon, and the rest are layered technologies of consciousness, ritual sequences disguised as miracles, archetypal journeys encoded into historical narratives. Each story, a ceremony. Each character, a mask worn by a force. And you were never meant to worship the mask. You were meant to recognize yourself behind it. The version of the Bible you know was edited, translated, diluted, domesticated. The fire was replaced with instruction. The symbolism was replaced with literalism. But the original text, the real Bible, was not meant for the pew. It was written for initiates, for those ready to pierce the veil and see the mechanics of reality itself. Because this isn't religion. This is interface. This is circuitry. This is programming the structure of the soul. When Jesus said, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom," he wasn't speaking metaphorically. He wasn't handing out fish and comfort. He was handing out keys. He cloaked divine technology in the language of shepherds and farmers, because the truth couldn't be given to those who weren't ready to be undone by it. His miracles were not random acts of compassion. They were precise rituals of transformation. He wasn't breaking the laws of nature. He was revealing how to align with them. He wasn't performing magic tricks. He was showing you how to rewire the matrix from within. So maybe the Bible wasn't meant to be obeyed. Maybe it was meant to be unlocked. To understand the true nature of this book, you have to abandon everything you've been told about what it is. The Bible isn't a storybook. It isn't a moral compass. It isn't a record of divine law. It's a multidimensional artifact constructed with surgical precision to hide, encode, and transmit power. What appears on the surface as a patchwork of hymns, commandments, genealogies, and sermons is in fact a layered encryption system where every name, every number, every symbol vibrates with hidden intention. The Bible isn't flat, it's holographic, and like any ancient spellbook, it's designed so only the initiated will see what's really there. What if the reason the Bible seems inconsistent, contradictory, even chaotic, wasn't because it was poorly written, but because it was never meant to be read linearly? Mystics throughout history have claimed the text was constructed like a machine. Letters and words act like gears, locking into divine mathematics, sacred geometry, celestial symbolism. It reads like poetry on the outside, but on the inside, it's circuitry. And the moment you stop reading it as a doctrine and start reading it like a blueprint, the system activates. The stories aren't commands, they're constructs. They don't describe behavior, they encode becoming. This is why initiates memorize the text, why mystics meditated on single letters for years, why entire sects disappeared underground to preserve fragments. Because this wasn't about religion, it was about accessing the root code of consciousness itself. They believed that when God spoke the world into being, it wasn't metaphor, it was mechanics. That language itself is the engine of reality. That the divine name, YHWH, isn't a title but a formula, a four-part process of creation, flowing from idea to embodiment and back again. That, in the beginning was the Word, isn't poetry, it's literal architecture. And once you see that, everything changes. The Bible stops being a story you're supposed to believe in and becomes a technology you're supposed to operate. Just like a spell book, it responds not to faith, but to function, not to worship, but to will. It doesn't matter what you believe about it, it matters what you do with it, which is why the ancient teachers never spoke the true names of God aloud, not because it was forbidden, but because it was dangerous, because names weren't names, they were instructions, triggers, keys to open gates that most people are never prepared to walk through. And yet, the gates are still there. The keys are still waiting, not in a far-off temple, not in the sky, but hidden between the lines of the book you thought you knew, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the one who knows how to listen between the words. There comes a moment, often quiet, sometimes terrifying, when you realize the Bible was never meant to be read the way you were taught. It wasn't a book to sit politely with in pews, reciting its lines like ritualized lullabies. It was never meant to be reduced to Sunday school summaries or cherry-picked verses plastered on Instagram. The real text, the actual structure of it, was engineered not to be followed, but to be decoded. This wasn't a book for the faithful. It was a tool for the fearless, because this book doesn't speak to the surface mind. It bypasses logic. It bends around theology. It was designed to reach something deeper, the circuitry of your being, the soul's operating system. It reads you as much as you read it. When you open it with the right eyes, it stops being a storybook and begins to act like a mirror. You see yourself in every parable, every miracle, every fall from grace and rise from death. Not as metaphor, but as instruction. The Bible is not about history, it is about activation. It's a living ritual, an interactive spell, and most people are reading it like it's a bedtime story. But here's the secret the mystics and magicians always knew. It's not the content alone that carries power, it's the structure. The very scaffolding of the text is mystical. Every name, every lineage, every number is part of a hidden calculus. 7 days, 12 tribes, 40 years, 72 names. They aren't random. They're not symbolic fluff. They are nodes in a system, coordinates on a grid, embedded instructions in a ritual network so old and so refined that even modern science hasn't caught up with its precision. Take Genesis, for example. You've been told it's a creation myth, but to the initiated, Genesis isn't history, it's mechanics. Let there be light wasn't a metaphor, it was a frequency, an invocation of sacred sound, an act of manifestation through vibration. The Hebrew alphabet isn't just a language. Each letter is a number, each number a vibration, each vibration a force, which means every verse is a layered formula, a sacred equation, a line of executable code. And then there's the tetragrammaton, Yod-He-Vav-He, the unspeakable name of God. Not because it's forbidden, because it's functional. It's not a word, It's a circuit diagram, a sacred sequence representing the descent of divine energy from the infinite into form, from spirit to flesh, from consciousness to matter. Kabbalists called it the four worlds: emanation, creation, formation, action. It's not theology, it's software. It's the divine blueprint written into your nervous system, into your DNA. That's why mystics didn't pray to God. They worked with God, through sound, through symbol, through inner alignment. To speak the divine name with true intention was never about reverence. It was about recalibration. You don't call on the divine as an outsider. You speak the name and feel it resonate in your bones, because that name is already etched into your soul. You're not worshiping something outside you. You're realigning what's already inside you. And that's why the ancients protected this knowledge with veils and parables, because it wasn't safe in the hands of the uninitiated, not because it was evil, because it was potent. If reality is structured by vibration and the Bible encodes the master frequencies, then to misuse them is to tinker with the framework of the cosmos itself. To chant the Psalms with no understanding is to fire arrows in the dark. To invoke a name without alignment is to summon fire you're not ready to carry. So the text was layered, the stories were veils, the metaphors were armor, because beneath it all was something not everyone was ready to face. The Bible isn't a manual for morality, it's a device for transformation. And you were never meant to fear it, you were meant to use it. If you still think Jesus performed miracles to impress people, you haven't been paying attention. You've been taught they were signs of divinity, proof that he was the Son of God, the chosen one, separate from you, above you. But what if the opposite is true? What if every so-called miracle wasn't proof of his godhood, but a demonstration of yours? What if these weren't just divine interventions, but carefully choreographed rituals designed to activate something dormant in the observer? What if the miracle wasn't what he did, but what it was meant to awaken? Jesus wasn't breaking the laws of physics. He was operating above them. He was showing you what it looks like when the human being reclaims divine alignment. The blind man doesn't just receive sight. He receives vision, inner vision, clarity, the ability to see truth through illusion. That's not a healing. That's a software upgrade, a reboot of perception. When he walks on water, it's not about defying gravity. It's about rising above the unconscious. The storm isn't just weather. It's symbolic of the chaos within: fear, anxiety, emotional turbulence. And when he steps calmly onto the waves, when he moves across the surface untouched by the storm, he's not saying, "Look what I can do." He's saying, "This is how you master your inner world." Every act you thought was random compassion was actually ritual transmission. Turning water into wine? That's not a party trick. It's alchemy. Water is the unconscious. It reflects, but it doesn't transform. Wine is fermented, matured. It's consciousness that's been awakened through the fire of time. And then he says, you can't put new wine in old skins. Translation: you can't pour divine truth into an ego still tied to its old identity. The container must be remade. Even the resurrection wasn't a one-time event. It was a template, a ritual dramatization of the eternal cycle of ego death and spiritual rebirth. Descent into shadow, surrender, re-emergence in light. The body in the tomb? That's the self you think you are. The rising? That's what happens when you remember what's been buried. The divine spark within you. Every miracle, every healing, every strange parable and cryptic phrase was part of the same system, a hidden curriculum, not for belief, but for becoming. And Jesus was never asking for worship. He was offering initiation, a path, a method, a transformation system disguised as folklore. But the crowd missed it. They always do. They watched the signs, but didn't see the code beneath. They wanted spectacle, not symbols. And that's why he said it out loud, again and again. Let those with ears hear. Because most wouldn't. He didn't come to comfort the world. He came to crack it open. And the miracles? They weren't the destination. They were the map. You were taught that the Bible is earthbound, that it's rooted in historical events, dusty cities, empires, kings, bloodlines, that it's about people, real or imagined, locked in time. But the deeper you go, the more something strange begins to happen. The stories lose their linearity. Characters begin to mirror each other. Numbers repeat. Cycles emerge. Patterns ripple beneath the surface like hidden tides. And then it hits you. This was never about history. This is celestial architecture. Mythic code. Take the 12 disciples. You probably thought they were just a group of men Jesus happened to choose. But why 12? Why not 10? Or 15? Why is that number embedded everywhere? 12 tribes of Israel. 12 gates of the temple. 12 stars around the Virgin in Revelation. Why does that number pulse beneath the entire narrative like a drumbeat? Because 12 isn't random. It's cosmic structure. It's the wheel of the zodiac, the 12 archetypes that govern both the heavens and the psyche. And Jesus? He doesn't just stand in the center. He orbits through it. Just like the sun. That's the key most people miss. Jesus isn't just the Son of God. He's the sun itself, moving through the great cosmic circle, illuminating each sign, each archetype, each aspect of consciousness. He brings light to all 12, then descends into shadow, only to rise again. This is not coincidence. It's cosmic allegory. And once you see it, everything shifts. Peter, the rock. Judas, the betrayer. John, the beloved. These aren't just historical figures. They're internal aspects of you, archetypes, initiatory phases of your own transformation. The impulsive warrior, the shadow of betrayal, the pure heart of devotion. They're not just characters, they're keys, masks worn by the soul on its long return to wholeness. The gospel becomes something radically different through this lens. Not a moral tale, but a map. A psychological and spiritual map encrypted in story. The resurrection isn't just an event, it's a cycle. The Last Supper isn't just a dinner, it's a ritual alignment of archetypes, the passion, death, and rebirth of Christ. It's not a single act, it's the movement of the sun across the wheel, through light and dark, through descent and return, and it doesn't stop at the sky. The 12 live inside you. The zodiac isn't just out there, it's a mirror of the internal heavens. Each sign reflects a dimension of the soul, each planet, a force. The Bible isn't describing something external, it's mapping your inner cosmos. Just like ancient temples were built in alignment with the stars, this text is constructed as a living astrological interface, linking body to sky, soul to sun, man to myth. Because the gospel was never just a story, it was an invitation to see the sky within you, to realize that you were never meant to worship the sun, you were meant to become it. Once you see the 12, once you recognize the archetypes, the zodiac, the sacred wheel encoded into scripture, another pattern starts to rise beneath it. A quieter rhythm, a deeper beat. Because 12 is the structure, the architecture of the soul's evolution. But there's another number that moves it, energizes it, breathes life into it. That number is 7. 7 days of creation, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 churches in Revelation, 7 spirits before the throne. Even the menorah, the sacred lampstand in the temple, was crafted with 7 flames. Why? Because to the ancients, 7 wasn't just spiritual, it was astronomical. In the pre-modern sky, there were exactly 7 visible celestial bodies: the sun, moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. These were not abstract. They were living intelligences, forces, powers. They weren't just out there. They were inside you, mirrors of your inner mechanics, the fire in your blood, the pressure in your chest, the hunger in your thoughts, each one aligned with a frequency of consciousness, each one a planetary gate. So when the Bible repeats 7 again and again, it's not superstition, it's code. The 12 zodiac signs form the wheel, the cycle of soul evolution through archetype. The 7 planets are the engine, the current that turns the wheel. One gives structure, the other gives motion. Even Genesis 1:1, the very first verse of the Bible, is composed of 7 Hebrew words, not by accident, but by design. Because the Bible wasn't just written, it was built as a machine, a frequency device, an encoded interface between man and the divine. Each of the 7 lights corresponds to a layer of consciousness. The moon, emotion, memory, reflection. Mercury, mind, speed, language. Venus, desire, attraction, heart. Mars, drive, conflict, fire. Jupiter, expansion, wisdom, vision. Saturn, time, structure, death. The sun, self, center, light. These weren't mythological metaphors. They were psychological tools, and the ancient mystics knew how to use them. They didn't worship the planets. They aligned with them. They mapped them into the body. They used their names in rituals, their hours for prayer, their order for sacred design. And the Bible, beneath the names, the commandments, the stories, quietly follows this order. Because it wasn't just trying to teach you about God. It was trying to show you how to interface with God's system. The menorah wasn't a decoration. It was a schematic, a burning diagram of divine order. 7 flames, 7 forces, 7 functions, lighting the path through 12 archetypal gates, 7 inside 12, energy moving through form, soul moving through story, flame burning through flesh. And once you see that, you begin to understand. The Bible isn't obsessed with numbers. It's built from them. It doesn't preach astrology. It is astrology, disguised as doctrine, encrypted as parable, encoded as myth. Because the real spiritual journey doesn't end in a sermon or a prayer. It begins the moment you realize that heaven isn't up there. It's in motion, and you are built in its image. You were told the Bible is a book of stories. But what if it's not even meant to be read as language? At least not in the way modern people understand it. What if every word, every letter, every stroke on the scroll is more than writing? What if it's programming? In the Hebrew tradition, language isn't separate from mathematics. Letters aren't just symbols for sounds. Each one is a number, a shape, a vibration, which means every name, every verse, every line of scripture is a string of code, active, intelligent, humming with layered instruction. This is not poetry. This is encryption. This is the world of gematria, a mystical science that maps numbers to letters, letters to concepts, and concepts to divine archetypes. In gematria, the word for life and the word for God are numerically intertwined. The word for man and fire reflect each other. It's not random, it's architecture. The divine name YHWH itself, 4 letters, is not simply a name, but a formula. Yod, 10, Heh, 5, Vav, 6, Heh, 5, again. Add them together, and you get 26. And that number, 26, echoes through the text like a hidden drumbeat. It shows up in structural formulas, in line counts, in deeper layers of symmetry. Not because someone added it later, but because this book was constructed like a temple. Every measurement precise, every number sacred, every brick laid by an unseen engineer. The mystics believed that the Bible was not written by God. It was God, not in the religious sense, but in the structural sense, that its letters were the divine presence encoded into form, that when you read the text, not with the intellect, but with the soul, you didn't just understand truth, you made contact with the source. And the more deeply you penetrated the language, the closer you got to what they called the Ein Sof, the unnameable infinite, the silent origin from which all vibration emerges. In this framework, a sentence in Scripture is not a static phrase. It's an activation sequence, a carefully ordered alignment of frequencies that, when spoken aloud or meditated on correctly, unlocks specific energies in the body and psyche. This is why sacred recitation exists across traditions, not to memorize, but to resonate, to shape the vessel of the self through the tuning of sound. The Hebrew alphabet itself is considered a technology, each letter a unique flame, each one containing layers of spiritual physics. That's why mystics would spend lifetimes studying just a handful of verses, why they would meditate on a single letter for years, because the surface meaning was never the point. The meaning was the trap. It kept the unready from going deeper, because beneath the garment of grammar, beneath the illusion of narrative, there is a humming, vibrating, geometric machine, alive with will, encoded with power, waiting for someone who knows how to speak its true language. And when you do, when you stop reading for comfort and start decoding for resonance, the Bible stops being a moral document. It becomes a device, not for faith, but for creation. You've heard the name of God, maybe whispered, maybe shouted from pulpits. But what if the real names were never meant to be spoken at all? At least, not by the uninitiated. What if the names we were given in church were masks, surface echoes, while the true names were kept in shadow, passed hand to hand in secret, not because they were heretical, but because they were dangerous, not in a moral sense, in an energetic one, because these names don't ask for belief. They don't require obedience. They do something. They activate. They rewrite the architecture of the soul. Enter the 72 names of God, not names like Father or Creator, but raw vibrational codes, each only 3 letters long, each derived from one of the most mathematically precise sections of the Hebrew Bible. In Exodus, there are 3 verses, each with exactly 72 letters. To most readers, this looks like stylized repetition, but to the mystics, this was a sequence, a ritual structure. When these verses are aligned and read in a specific method, alternating forwards and backwards, they generate 72 unique triads of Hebrew letters, 72 gates, 72 sparks, 72 keys to the divine interface. These names were never taught to the masses. They weren't even read aloud in temple. They were contemplated, meditated on in silence, whispered with intention, carved into amulets, written into grimoires, each one aligned with a particular force of creation. Some were said to heal, others to break illusions. Some revealed inner sight, others burned away shadow. But none of them operated on faith. They were not prayers. They were commands. You didn't chant these names to beg for mercy. You invoked them to recalibrate. Because they weren't directed at a being in the clouds. They were aimed at the deepest strata of your own being. These weren't names in the ordinary sense. They were codes. each one a unique configuration of divine frequency, like 72 subroutines in the source code of reality. And it gets stranger. Each of these names, when reduced numerically, ties into deeper symbolic frameworks, planetary forces, elemental energies, even anatomical regions of the soul. Mystics mapped these names onto the body, the stars, the calendar, the tarot. Not because they were guessing, but because they saw what the text was really doing. They understood that the Torah was not a historical record. It was a machine, a divine instrument composed not of wood and wire, but of letter, number, and flame. Even more astonishing, when you take 72 names of 3 letters each, you get 216 letters total. That number, 216, echoes through mystical texts, through architecture, through gematria. It's the cube of 6. It's the number of bones in the human body. And in some ancient schools, it was said to be the number of the soul's configuration. In modern times, this might sound like fantasy, but we already understand it intuitively. Code runs your devices. Algorithms shape your reality. Why would it be any different at the level of spirit? The ancients knew this. That's why these names weren't taught. That's why they were protected. Because if you don't know how to hold them, they will burn you. Not physically, but psychically. They rearrange your inner structure. They bring suppressed memories to the surface. They collapse ego. They reveal. And this is why religion buried them. Because a person who activates even one of these names stops being a follower. They stop asking permission. They stop waiting for heaven. They start to realize heaven was built into them all along. It just needed the right sequence to be activated. Forget what you've been told about angels. They're not winged figures floating in clouds, singing lullabies or delivering vague encouragements from above. That image was crafted to comfort you, to make the mystery feel manageable. But in the ancient mystical systems, angels were never soft. They were not symbolic, and they were not separate from you. Angels weren't external beings that showed up when you were in trouble. They were forces, frequencies, spiritual technologies embedded in the cosmos and in you. In the Kabbalistic tradition, once the 72 names of God were established, the next revelation came naturally. Each name could be fused with divine suffixes, like El, meaning of God, or Yah, representing the divine breath, to form living intelligences. And from that fusion emerged 72 angels, not decorative figures, but archetypal functions, each one corresponding to a particular energy field, a spiritual law, an initiatory stage of awakening. Michael, who is like God? Not a question, a challenge, an invocation of courage, clarity, and spiritual authority. Gabriel, strength of God, the force that delivers truth even when it disrupts comfort. Raphael, healing of God, not a rescuer, but the activation of the healer within. These weren't fictional entities. They were modes of being, aspects of consciousness encoded in divine language. But here's what they never told you. To invoke an angel is not to ask for help. It is to embody its essence. When you call upon Michael, you don't wait for protection. You become the protector. When you connect with Raphael, you're not begging for healing. You're activating the blueprint of healing already buried in your field. These names are not doors to something external. They are mirrors. And when spoken with intention, aligned with will, and guided by knowledge, they awaken their function inside you. This is why mystics never summoned angels with desperation. They approached them as partners, as reflections of what they were becoming. Angels weren't answers. They were assignments. You didn't call one down unless you were ready to step into the force it represented, because that force would begin to transform you, not gently, not politely, but precisely. It would burn away illusions. It would rearrange your energy. It would call your shadow to the surface so your light could finally stand unobstructed. To the mystics, every angel was also a flame, a divine spark wrapped in code. When activated, that flame would clear a pathway, internally and externally. Thoughts would shift, dreams would deepen, patterns would collapse, synchronicities would align, but only if you understood that the name itself wasn't the power. You were. The name was the key, but the lock was inside you. This is what religious systems feared, because once you realize angels are not guardians above you, but functions within you, you stop needing intermediaries. You stop outsourcing your power. You stop being a subject and start becoming a sovereign. The one who walks into the temple not to kneel, but to awaken the fire at its center. Because the truth is, the angels were never outside. They were always inside, waiting for the sound of your voice, for the clarity of your intention, for the moment you remembered they were never here to save you. They were here to remind you who you really are. If each divine name has a purpose, if each angel is a code for light, healing, vision, then what lives on the other side of that mirror? Because every spiritual system, from the temples of Egypt to the cathedrals of Europe, has whispered the same truth. Where there is light, there is also shadow. And the deeper the light burns, the more profound the darkness that forms around it. Not to destroy it, but to define it. Not to oppose it, but to complete it. So, if there are 72 names of God, vibrations of divine force, access keys to awakening, then there are also 72 counterparts, not created to defy heaven, but to reflect the parts of heaven that religion refused to face. These are the 72 demons. Their names preserved not in scripture, but in secret grimoires like the Ars Goetia, passed down from hand to hand among magicians and mystics, who understood that you cannot rise into power until you descend into the self. You were taught to fear demons, but the ancients didn't fear them. They worked with them because the demons weren't monsters. They were metaphors. They weren't evil. They were incomplete. They represented forces of nature left unintegrated, obsessions unexamined, desires denied, rage locked away, genius repressed. Each one wasn't a danger to the soul unless you ignored it. They only became devils when they were left in the dark too long. To the mystics, each demon corresponded directly to one of the 72 angels, a perfect inversion. The same structure, the same sigil logic, the same three-letter name base, but reversed in polarity. Where one offered healing, the other magnified disease. Where one opened sight, the other drowned it in illusion. They were not separate species. They were the same archetypes, seen through different eyes, through wounded eyes. Summoning a demon wasn't an act of rebellion. It was a form of spiritual mirror work, a way to confront the shadow directly, in ritual space, with intention and control. Because left buried, these energies become fate. They manifest in your relationships, your addictions, your self-sabotage. But when brought into the circle, into light, into awareness, they become fuel. They become power. They become you, reintegrated. This was the true function of Solomonic magic. Solomon, the wise king who built the temple, was also said to have bound demons with sacred seals, not to torment them, but to command the unconscious, to master chaos. He was not a priest. He was a magician, a sovereign. One who knew the deeper layers of the divine don't separate light and dark. They transmute both. In the Goetia, each demon has a sigil, a name, a rank, a function. They're treated not as beasts, but as intelligences, each with a domain: memory, influence, creation, destruction. And when invoked correctly, through the same divine names, through the same psalms, the same Hebrew architecture, they respond, not to blind worship, but to will. This is not fantasy. This is inner alchemy, because the real demon isn't Baal or Paimon. The real demon is your unspoken pain, your generational trauma, the belief that you are unworthy of your own power, the refusal to look into the corners of your psyche that still run your life in silence. To summon a demon is not to open a portal to hell, it's to step into your own unconscious, to stare at the chaos within and say, I see you, I'm not afraid of you, you don't own me, you are me. And from that moment forward, the war inside starts to end. Not because the light destroyed the dark, but because the two were never at war. They were always trying to reunite. Long before modern psychology found the language to speak about the unconscious, mystics were already walking through it with ritual, symbol, and fire. They mapped its tunnels, invoked its archetypes, and faced its shadows, not in theory, but in direct experience. And when Carl Jung emerged in the early 20th century, he didn't just create a psychological system. He rediscovered what the mystics already knew, that the unconscious is not a disorder to be cured, but a temple to be entered. Jung didn't theorize from a distance. He descended. He entered altered states. He allowed voices, visions, and symbols to rise from his own depths. And in the Red Book, his private and most haunting work, he documented those journeys. Vivid conversations with figures like Philemon, the wise old man, Salome, the feminine anima, Elijah, the prophet guide. To the modern eye, these seem like hallucinations, but to Jung and to the mystics before him, they were archetypes, not fantasies, structures, ancient intelligences, programs embedded in the human psyche, waiting to be seen and integrated. When Jung spoke of the shadow, he wasn't moralizing. He wasn't warning you away. He was calling you toward it. Because the shadow, he said, is not evil. It's everything you've repressed, denied, pushed down in order to survive. And until you face it, until you speak to it, until you allow it into your awareness, it will run your life in silence. Until you make the unconscious conscious, he wrote, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This is not psychology. This is magic, because the grimoires of old, those mysterious books of spirits and rituals, were not primitive attempts at control. They were early manuals of active imagination, long before that term existed. When the magicians summoned Michael, they weren't calling on a guy with wings. They were invoking the archetype of protection, of will, of divine alignment. When they summoned a goetic demon, they weren't trafficking with hell. They were daring to confront their own chaos, to bind the storm inside with the language of light. Jung understood this. He wrote of alchemy not as superstition, but as metaphor, a symbolic system for inner transformation. The transmutation of base materials into gold was never about metal. It was about turning unintegrated instinct into awakened insight. And that's exactly what the mystics were doing. They weren't performing spells. They were reconstructing the self. What the magicians called invocation, Jung called individuation. What they called spirit, he called symbol. What they called demons, he called complexes. But the path was the same. And in that alignment, we see it clearly. The so-called occult was never about external forces. It was always about the architecture of the soul. Whether drawn in chalk on a temple floor or mapped in the pages of the Red Book, the journey inward is the same. It leads you through darkness. It shows you your fears. It drags up your shame, your lust, your rage, your brilliance, not to torment you, but to complete you. Because you can't become whole by pretending to be pure. You become whole by being willing to hold both, light and dark, angel and demon, heaven and hell, not as opposites, but as siblings, as forces meant to dance, to balance, to finally become one. And that is the real path of the mystic, not to transcend the world, but to integrate it, not to worship the divine, but to embody it. By now the illusion is crumbling. The idea that the Bible was written to be read like a novel, recited like a hymn, or obeyed like a rule book was never the truth. It was the distraction. Because the Bible wasn't designed to be followed, it was engineered to be activated. Everything you've been taught to skim past, the repetition, the strange numbers, the cryptic names, the unusual sentence structure, isn't bad translation. It's intentional encoding. The mystics knew that reality isn't made of matter. It's made of pattern, of rhythm, of vibration. And once you understand that, you realize that this book, this so-called scripture, isn't religious literature. It's a multi-dimensional technology. The Psalms, not poems, incantations. The divine names, not titles, frequency codes. The genealogies, not history, numerical algorithms. Even the gaps between verses, the syllabic beats, the number of letters in a line, are part of the machine. To most people, Genesis is the creation myth, but to the Kabbalists, Genesis 1:1 is the first line of executable code. 7 Hebrew words, 28 letters, each one carrying a numerical signature, each letter vibrating with intention. In Gematria, the mystical system that assigns number values to letters, these verses form mathematical matrices, not metaphors. And they aren't symbolic in the poetic sense. They are instructions. When God speaks the universe into existence, it's not a literary device. It's the deepest truth ever hidden in plain sight. Sound becomes structure. Word becomes world. Vibration becomes manifestation. And the mystics took this seriously. That's why they didn't read the Torah. They dissected it, rearranged its letters, chanted its names. They weren't worshiping a deity. They were interacting with a system. The Kabbalists even went so far as to say, the stories are only garments. The true Torah lies beneath. In other words, if you think Moses, Abraham, Noah, and the rest are just characters, you've missed the entire point. These are archetypal programs, embedded subroutines, each one mapping not historical events, but stages of inner development, not outer commandments, but inner activations. And when you understand that, the Bible shifts. It goes from being a book that controls you to a manual that liberates you, from rules to read, to scripts to run, from narrative to technology. But here's the reason most never see it. It requires intention. The interface doesn't respond to casual curiosity. You don't unlock it by skimming or quoting. You engage it like you would an ancient machine, with focus, with resonance, with presence. That's why the Psalms weren't recited. They were intoned. That's why divine names weren't spoken. They were vibrated through the bones, through the breath. That's why sigils weren't decorations. They were maps, glyphs that bypassed logic and spoke directly to the unconscious. Every symbol, every name, every number, every silence between the words was part of the code. And once you see that, you stop asking what the Bible means and start asking what it does, because it was never about belief. It was always about access. If the Bible is a code, if the Psalms are spells, the names are frequencies, the symbols are sigils, then what exactly is being activated? You've been told it opens the gates of heaven or shields you from the fires of hell. But those gates were never in the sky, and those fires were never under the earth, because heaven and hell were never places. They are states, vibrations, frequencies of the mind and soul that you move through every single day. Whether you realize it or not, you've felt them. Heaven isn't a palace behind clouds. It's that moment of such stillness, such clarity, such peace that your thoughts finally stop screaming and your breath feels like light. When the mind goes silent and all that remains is presence. Hell isn't a pit of flames. It's the panic at 3 a.m., the loop of shame, the noise of voices in your head that won't let you rest, the rage you turn inward because you don't know where else to aim it. These are vibrational realms, and they exist within you. Right now, and this is the secret buried in every mystical tradition. You don't go to heaven. You ascend into it. You don't get dragged to hell. You descend by forgetting who you are, which means the Bible isn't pointing you to another world. It's giving you a map of this one, layered beneath your skin, beneath your thoughts. A spiritual topography of ascent and descent. The angels aren't coming to rescue you. They are aspects of your higher self, patterns of potential, divine configurations within your own field. And the demons? They're not hunting you. They're already there, in the pain you've silenced, in the trauma you've buried, in the emotions you've refused to name. The ones that rule you from behind the scenes. So when the mystic calls an angel, they're not summoning wings. They're stepping into alignment. When they face a demon, they're not opening a portal to chaos. They're finally naming the unspoken force within. The Bible becomes a toolkit, not to control the world, but to transform perception, to move from inner darkness into inner clarity, from distortion into coherence. This is what the spells are for, not to conjure fantasy, but to refine vibration. This is why the Psalms were chanted with such precision, why the divine names were whispered on specific breaths, why the sigils were traced with trembling reverence, because they weren't superstitions, they were alignments. The ancients understood something we've forgotten. Language shapes reality. Word is vibration. Vibration shapes form. And form determines experience. So if you live in hell, it's because the frequencies within you have collapsed into noise, fear, fragmentation. And if you taste heaven, it's because your inner structure has harmonized with a deeper law. The psalm becomes a tone. The divine name becomes a tuning fork. The ritual becomes a key. And the Bible? It becomes a frequency map of the soul. In this view, Judgment Day isn't in the future. It's the moment you look in the mirror and see the war inside your own eyes. Heaven and hell aren't destinations, they're conditions. And the real power of this forgotten technology wasn't in what it promised after death. It was in what it revealed while you're still alive. So now the veil lifts. You've seen what lies beneath the parables, beneath the dogma, beneath the centuries of translation and control. You've seen the codes, names that were never meant to be spoken but activated. You've seen the Psalms, not as poetry, but as vibrational keys. You've seen angels and demons, not as myth, but as fragments of the self, mapped in ritual, mirrored in psyche. And you've begun to understand what this all means. The Bible was never asking you to believe, it was asking you to awaken. You were told to read it like a prisoner reads laws, carefully, fearfully, obediently. But it was written like a spell book, coded, layered, recursive. It was never meant to be followed. It was meant to be unlocked. Every chapter, every verse, every sigil, every silence between lines, a part of a spiritual operating system. Every ritual, every parable, every miracle, a symbolic interface. Every name of God, a frequency modulator. Every demon, a mirror for your disowned power. Every angel, a pathway to divine alignment. and every line that told you to bow. A challenge to see through the illusion and remember that you were never below it. You are the system. You are the code. You are the one holding the flame. And now you understand why they buried this, why the mystics were exiled, why the magicians were burned, why the Gnostic texts were erased. Because power in the hands of the church is control, but power in the hands of the awakened is liberation. They needed you to see Jesus as unreachable. They needed you to see the Bible as untouchable. They needed you to think the divine was always out there, in heaven, in temples, in books guarded by men in robes. But it never was. It was inside you. It was in your breath, your blood, your memory, your bones. It was in your voice when you speak with clarity, in your silence when you sit with truth. It was in the vibration of your name before you were even born. So now, go back to the book, but this time open it with new eyes, not the eyes of a worshiper, but of a code breaker, a seeker, a sovereign. Read the parables like riddles. Speak the names like mantras. Trace the symbols like you're holding the blueprint of creation itself. Because maybe you are. You were never meant to worship the divine. You were meant to become it.